you I was missing, but I wasn't lost. I was walking through the streets in the cold and frost. Manchester, looking for the place that I used to know, and then I saw some people and it started to snow on Manchester.
So what is it about Manchester that makes it such a preeminent city of music?
Well, it's a question that's bothered musicologists for quite some time. It is a city that seems to be uniquely placed in the history of popular music because it repeatedly jumps in feet first into great music, great scenes, and on an international level. And we can look at places like Newcastle, Birmingham, Bristol. We see groups come from there, but it's never as consistent as it has been from Manchester. And I think that's because Manchester, if you look very closely, you can see the trace of bullets being fired throughout history. There's always been a tremendous musicians' infrastructure here in Manchester that's enabled the different movements or genres or waves of music to happen and to continue and carry on so that one builds on the other. And we can look right back into the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. Mancunians demanded and devoured music at an incredible rate. We've got the birth of the Halle Orchestra, one of the great international classical orchestras. It's here in 1855. But you go back in 1780, the Gentlemen's Concerts is the beginning of the Halle. And they would get audiences of 2,500 to sometimes 5,000 people wanting to hear the latest classical music, which, if you think about it, is very punk. This stuff, it wasn't classical then, it was contemporary, but they wanted to hear it. Also, mixed in with that, you've got the Jewish elements, you've got Celtic elements, you've got folk elements, all of them pouring into this city, devouring people at an astonishing rate, but also producing culture at an astonishing rate. So if you look at, say, the Making of the English Working Class by E.P. Thompson, he writes at length about the creation of working class culture, and music was an essential part of that. It's not particularly radicalised or political. It's there as a release mechanism. It's there as a carriage system to take you away for an evening into a transport of delight. So by the 20th century, we've got the dance bands, we've got working class unemployed jazz bands, groups of people playing kazoos, wearing costumes, trying to outdo each other. They'd go to a football pitch or a recreation ground, and you'd get different jazz bands. Each street would have one, neighbourhoods would have them, cities would have them, and by the 1930s they'd have competitions against each other. Who were the best marching jazz bands? By the 1950s, because of the Second World War, we've got Burtonwood American Base, which is 25 miles away from Manchester, and it means that every weekend we get an influx of American musicians who are based there coming into Manchester, also going into Liverpool at the same time, and feeding into the groups that exist, principally at that time jazz bands. And the jazz bands were not your kind of acapella trad. These were modernists. These were people who were influenced by Charlie Parker, Dexter Gordon, and they wanted authentic black American players if they could get them, but they'd settle for white ones if they had the chops. This fed into a great interest began in Manchester to trace jazz back to its roots, and those roots come from folk blues, from whatever. And this led to an interest in people like Muddy Waters, Chicago R&B, so that at the end of the 1950s you've got a lot of groups who've come up watching the emerging rock and roll scene on television or at the cinema. They've come through skiffle, so they've got instruments, they can play them, but the music that's been developed is beat music, which essentially is a kind of white English version of R&B. But it's music with a beat, it's music for dancing to. And we get, by 1964, we can find over 200 beat clubs in the greater Manchester area. Some have come, some have gone, some are there for the whole period. But it's an astonishing amount of beat clubs. Now, this mirrors what's going on in Liverpool at the same time with what is known as Mersey beat. Again, the word beat races up there. But we get this strange separation. At one time, both scenes were mutually symbiotic. It's only 30 miles away. Got the East Lancs Road. In the early 60s, groups from each city would be passing one another on the East Lancs, waving to one another, playing each other's gigs, going backwards and forwards. People like Epstein, the promoters at Wooler at the Cavern, Danny Batesh in Manchester, the Abadi brothers, would book bands from Liverpool, Manchester, as I say, mutually symbiotic. But then came the Beatles, and the Beatles, for better or for worse, kind of destroyed that amicable relationship, because internationally people only saw Liverpool, the Mersey poets, the Mersey scene, the Mersey beats, the whatever, and Manchester kind of became the poor neighbour in musicological terms. So that even though Herman and the Hermits, who were the second biggest selling English group in America after the Beatles, were from Manchester, if you asked an American, they would say that they were from Liverpool, because they thought there was only Liverpool. Manchester began to emerge from under that shadow, I would say with 10cc at the end of the 1960s, early 1970s, because they brought a studio to Stockport. And this is a major studio. And I think a very undersung achievement. They put Manchester, Stockport on the map in terms of, oh yeah, I mean, people came from America to record there. Fascinating place. So the next wave is created by the musicians themselves. It was in 1972, because there were so few gigs, because not a lot of people know this, Manchester is the only city that I've come across that had an Act of Parliament passed to stop beat clubs. They were so, morally outraged at the beat clubs that the 1965 Corporation Act, which came into force, oddly enough, on the 1st of January 1966, was designed specifically to stop beat clubs and crush teenage rebellion. Not that it was particularly rebellious, but there you go. So there were very, very few venues for musicians. And when I started playing in the mid-60s, I could play every night of the week in the Greater Manchester area. By 1970, you were lucky if there was one gig a week. So in 1972, Victor Brox organised a meeting at the Beer Keller off Piccadilly, and the Music Force was founded, which was a musicians' cooperative, and it was a socialist organisation which was going to be, and indeed was, musicians taking control of their own destinies. And now that meant that they had an office where they would ring up, create venues, force venues into taking Mancunian groups. They would provide the transport if it was needed. They rent out PAs. They do the posters. Now, all this infrastructure, they even had a newspaper called Hot Flash, a music paper. All of this infrastructure was in place when Howard Trafford, who becomes Howard Devoto, turns up in 1976 at the Music Force offices asking where he might put on the Sex Pistols. And they direct him to the Lesser Free Trade Hall, and the rest, as they say, is history. Because we then get, with Buzzcocks and Spiral Scratch, which sets the template for the punk DIY ethos. This is the first kind of internationally recognised Manchester music scene, which by 1983 we can lump in the Smiths, the Hacienda has opened. By 1988 we've got the whole Manchester scene. By 1996 we've got the international recognition of Oasis. By 2000 we've got Badly Drawn Boy, we've had M People, and it continues to roll. It goes on and on and on. Manchester is a place that musicians now gravitate to. It's a place which produces again and again consistently good acts which are capable of breaking it on an international scale. And then I can't remember who actually said this, so my apologies, but it's impossible to talk about Manchester without talking about music, and it's impossible to talk about music without talking about Manchester. I think it's Haslam.
So it's not just the fact that we have lots of different nationalities and it's a place where people come to live, migrate. The point you're making is also that there is an infrastructure there going back a long time that laid the foundation to organising bands and organising music and performances. That's also an important reason, which I wasn't aware of myself.
I think that it's definitely my take on it, is that infrastructure has always enabled musicians to operate to their maximum ability. It encourages them. It doesn't necessarily facilitate them in getting a van. But there is nowadays we've got the Manchester Musicians online, which is a kind of self-help agency. Northwest Arts are now very interested in why are all these musicians in Manchester. They're also Northwest Arts are now interested in facilitating recording studios and that kind of thing, which I suppose is good. We've got the Manchester Music District Archive, which I'm one of the trustees of. There are a lot, even Urbis is very supportive of local musicians and the local music scene in terms of looking at the graphic design, the posters, album covers, T-shirts, Wellington boots. But no, for me it was I would argue it's the fact that there was always an infrastructure there. The cultural influences, I haven't even begun to scratch the surface of that. It's fascinating. Yes, the Irish and the Jews have a lot to answer for.
And maybe something in the water. Who was it said that there was something in the water?
Peter Hook said to me he thought that it was definitely something in the water when I put the question to him.
Okay.
And we both decided that we would agree on that, which would have been a much shorter answer for you.
What about the American influence and the Northern Soul thing? First of all, maybe you could explain what Northern Soul is. You recently did an excellent BBC radio programme about Northern Soul. But for people who don't know what is Northern Soul? And why was it so popular in Manchester and the north of England?
Gosh, that's like asking what is it about Manchester that makes musicians. Northern Soul is a genre. It's a musical genre, and it applies specifically to a kind of black urban American dance music of that's still being produced today, but of the 60s, let's say. So a grotesque example would be Tamla, though I know that that's anathema to most Northern Soul, but people would understand that. Black dance music, good poppy, catchy dance music. The phrase Northern Soul was originated by writer and promoter and all-round genius Dave Godin in an article in 1971, where he'd come to Manchester and seen what was happening at the Twisted Wheel, and said, if this has to have a name, let's call it Northern Soul, because Mancunian DJs had chosen a specific avenue of black American music that was very popular in the northwest of England. Now, it goes back to 1845, when the first blackface minstrel troupe, the Christie Minstrels, appeared in Manchester. Now, this might sound quite bizarre, but it began a fascination with black American music. The blackface minstrels were playing an approximation of black American music. That, strangely enough, filtered into Irish traditional music in the shape of the banjo and the bones. They saw them in Dublin, and within 10 years, people were playing banjos in pubs in Dublin and Galway and what have you, and the bones, which are free if you've killed a cow. So, the people in Manchester developed it. They loved it. They couldn't get enough of this kind of entertainment, and they came back again and again throughout the 19th century. Now, in the middle of the 19th century, the American Civil War was a period of great hardship in the northwest of England. We survived on cotton, and cotton couldn't get through because the Union fleets were blockading the southern ports. Now, the cotton workers of the Greater Manchester area were starving, but They marched in their thousands to support President Lincoln and for the emancipation of slaves, even if it meant that they would starve. So there'd always been this very, very close affinity between, or a recognition of African Americans and the struggle for freedom, for equality, which carries through into an appreciation of the music, up to a point in the mid-20th century where it becomes almost obsessive. And I think because there was a kind of a recognition or an empathy, a feeling that if you were a white working class kid in the great industrial North, you in your own way were oppressed, and you could look towards black American music either providing you with a voice in terms of blues or an articulation of your plight, or as a point of release. Within Northern Soul dance music, it's a release. It's an effective system for carrying you out of your physical body for 3-minute bursts. As long as the song lasts, you're dancing and you're away. And it also, to go out in another direction, there's a kind of exclusivity with Northern Soul, where people, I think, felt that they were onto something that nobody else was aware of. And that forms a very, very tight bond with all the other people who are gathered there with you. So it's very tribal. And I think in the North, whether we've been one generation in Manchester or 20 generations, we are very tribal about being Mancunians.
What other influences do you think, or connections are there between America and Manchester? As you mentioned about the cotton industry, and how much of an effect...
Well, the River Mersey finishes, it flows down the Pennines and it finishes in New York. So you've got that direct straight line across the Atlantic, and will leapfrog over Liverpool. I mean, Liverpool must have been so fed up when the Manchester Ship Canal said, well, we'll just bring the cotton to Manchester up this big river. Do you know it was supposed to end in Didsbury? The original Ship Canal company had their first meeting at Fletcher Moss, and the guy lived there, and he envisaged it being like on his doorstep, so he could just step onto the ship and go to America whenever he wanted to. So it would have carried on through Northenden up to Didsbury Village, which, imagine what it would have been like. The affinities with America, that direct line, immigration, a two-way street, lots and lots of business with America, particularly Cottonopolis, which we've already talked about, entertainment, musicians, Stan Laurel is from here. Charlie Chaplin was in the Seven Lancashire Lads clog dancing troupe before going with Fred Carno to America. So the Mancunian film studios existed in the 1920s doing silence, and then gave up when sound came along. But a guy called Bert Tracy, who was from Droylsden, had gone to Hollywood with Stan Laurel and had worked for Max Sennett, came back to Manchester, and Laurel and Hardy were coming to visit at the Midland Hotel, and he said to Johnny Blakely from the Mancunian Film Company, come along and meet the lads. And they got there, and Stan Laurel said, well, why aren't you making films anymore? And he said, well, it's too expensive, lad. And he said, well, just hire a studio. So they did, and they made the first George Formby movie, which is a massive hit, all because Laurel and Hardy came to Manchester, and Bert Tracy knew them, Mancunian knew them, and we get the birth of the proper Mancunian Film Company, which feeds into Granada Television and the BBC in a direct bloodline, in the same way that music is feeding in that Steve, I can't remember his second name because sadly he's been dead for a long time. If you look at the logo for Band on the Wall, it's there's a man with glasses and a little beard and a beret, and that was Steve who revitalised the Band on the Wall in the 1970s. Now in the 30s he'd been in the schoolboy jazz team in Ancoats, the Little Rascals jazz band, and they played at the Cotton Club in Harlem. So he'd gone from Ancoats to Harlem as a kind of novelty act, played there, came back obsessed with jazz, and we get that whole thing in the 1950s which feeds back into a desire to discover the roots of jazz, which takes them to see people like Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, John Lee Hooker, who were all regular performers in Manchester. So Screaming Jay Hawkins, all these people loved playing in Manchester. It was in some strange way. And they used to say things like it reminded them of America. Probably just being nice. But that meant that you could come to... Alexis Corner, who's like one of the founders of the British blues boom, had a flat in Manchester because he played up here so much, because kids wanted R&B, they wanted blues. Elton John, when he was in Steam Packet with Rod Stewart, said that the greatest place on the planet to play in terms of audience reaction was the Twisted Wheel. If they liked you, and that was it, you were back there every other week, and you had people who had permanent residences there. Spencer Davis, the Steam Packet, etc. So people like Neville, who's in one of my books about Bob Dylan, the first book I wrote, Like the Night. Neville worked at ABC Television in Didsbury, and every penny he had went on collecting blues records. And he couldn't believe it one night when Spencer Davis said, "Oh, we need somewhere to stay for the night." And he said, "You can stay at my house." And he lived in a council house in Wythenshawe with his mum, but he took Spencer Davis Group back, and he had a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and they just sat in his front room all night and played blues for him. This absolute... And you hear stories about kids in back-to-back terraced houses in the 1970s with lino on the floor, paying 50 quid for a single because they're that obsessed with the ownership of that authenticity, of that belonging. I don't know if there's... I'm out of the loop in a way now, but I don't know if there's still quite that same obsession with the authenticity and how house music pans out into black dance music. Is Kenny Dope Gonzalez a black New York DJ or a white New York DJ? I wouldn't know. But for years and years and years, the white working class kids in the northwest of England were very, very obsessive and very, very possessive about blues music because they had an affinity for it and they had a recognition of it.
I think I understand a bit more now, actually, from what you've been saying about why it is that Manchester has just got this sort of magic, what I'd call magic about it in terms of music. But you've really just scratched the surface. You've written... How many books have you written on music?
Well, I've written specifically... have published 3 books, and one on Bob Dylan's films, which we'll forget about, even though it's very good. But the first one was about Bob Dylan playing at the Manchester Free Trade Hall in 1966, which is a very pivotal moment for music generally. And
what's that book called?
That's called Like the Night, and in a sense it was the pivotal moment of the documentary last year, the Scorsese documentary, The Judas Shout, and it's one of the great climactic moments in music history. Now the most important book relevant to this is Shake, Rattle and Rain, which is a history of popular music in Manchester from 1955 to 95. And if I only had the wherewithal, I would write Shake, Rattle and Rain 2, which would be the history of popular music 1855 to 1995. Because I just keep discovering more and more about it all the time, and how they all interlink.
And just as a little aside, tell me about a few of the famous musicians that you've interviewed. Who are the most famous musicians? Maybe Manchester ones, maybe other ones.
Well, met or interviewed in my time. I met Jimi Hendrix, Pete Townsend. It's very hard to remember now. Everybody, because I was a professional musician for years and years. And the name of
the band that you played in?
Well, the first band was Greasy Bear. Then the next band was Alberto, the Albertos, or Alberto y los Tres Paranoias. And we played our way around Europe and did the obligatory bit of America. But in terms of interviews for the book, I got hold of as many people as I possibly could. So Peter Hook, Clint Boone. There were Pete Farrow, who's like an old beat group member. Well, yes, he is old. Yes, so he's an old beat group member. Basically, anybody I could get hold of. Bruce Mitchell, who's been playing since 1955 and is still playing with the Durruti column. Vinnie Riley, Ed Banger, Howard Devoto, Pete Shelley, but then also other people like Richard Boone, who is essential to the history of Manchester music. He ran New Hormones, which was Buzzcock's management company, but they also facilitated Linda Sterling and John Savage. At the moment, I'm compiling a list of people who are to do with Manchester music, not musicians per se, but people, because they get neglected.
And many of them are still around. But most people wouldn't know who they were.
No.
And yet they're enormously influential.
Very, very influential.
Can you give me an example of one of these influential people that you would see around?
Well, if you were in Stoke Newington, you'd see Richard. In Manchester, you can find
Tosh Ryan.
Tosh. Now, what would we say about Tosh? I mean, the founder of Rabid Records. He was a jazz saxophonist in the 1950s. In the 1960s, played with the Victor Brox Blues Train. He'd also played with John Mayall. Was a founder member of Music Force in 1972. Founded Rabid Records in 1977. Has been creating a massive kind of digital video archive of Manchester musicians, which we don't currently know the whereabouts of. He's misplaced it, but he was trying to interview every single musician he could get hold of. So there have been people trying to chronicle it and hold it together. That's now being carried out by the district music archive.
Yeah, that's what I also wanted to ask you about, because if people are interested in finding out more about Manchester music in general, where can they find the information?
It's on our website, which is just undergoing reconstruction. But if you do a Google for Manchester District Music Archive, you'll find it, and it's being relaunched at the end of September in an interactive way. So what we want people to do is, it's a bit like Wikipedia, in that you can access the information we have and you can add your own information to it. And we don't just want Jeff Davis, who played bass guitar in the Rattlesnakes or the Denton Boomerangs. We want people who went to gigs, who would say, I used to go to Rafters and I thought it was fantastic, and I can remember Rob Gretton DJing or what have you. So we want the memories because music can't exist without the audience, and we want their reaction just as much as we want the input from musicians. So this is the new website, which is launched at the end of this coming September, will be the springboard. It'll be kind of virtual museum, which is the springboard towards us hopefully opening up the actual physical premises.
Okay, well, that was a fascinating little session there, scratching the surface of a fascinating subject, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much.